I have exactly 60 minutes. That's what the notification said when it flashed across my phone at 6:14 this morning. A cold, automated reminder from the smart home hub that Marcus had installed 3 months ago, disguised as a security upgrade. 60 minutes before the digital lock cycle. 60 minutes before the access codes reset to something only he knows. 60 minutes before I become, once again, a prisoner in a house that has my name on the deed but somehow never felt like mine. My name is Claire, and I need you to understand something before I tell you everything. I am not dramatic. I am not unstable. I am not the woman my husband spent 2 years quietly convincing me I was. I am a 34-year-old former marketing manager with a graduate degree, a careful mind, and the kind of patience that people mistake for weakness until they realize it was always strategy. But let me start at the beginning because the beginning matters. Because what happened to me didn't begin with a hidden keypad or a basement full of surveillance equipment. It began much quieter than that. It began with silence. If you've never lived with the silent treatment as a weapon, let me describe it for you. It's not like the silence after an argument, that bruised, heavy quiet that still hums with emotion. This was different. Marcus's silence was surgical, deliberate. He could sit across from me at the breakfast table, both of us eating toast, and the air between us would feel vacuumed out. Not empty, pressurized, like the inside of a submarine. It started about 18 months into our marriage. We'd been together for 3 years before that, happy, I thought. He was charming in the way that certain intelligent men are charming. A little aloof, deeply focused, the kind of man who remembered details. He remembered that I took oat milk in my coffee, that I hated the sound of clocks ticking, that I always cried at documentaries about animals, but never at films made to make you cry. He said it meant I had a pure heart. I thought that was romantic. I didn't yet understand that a man who studies you that closely is not always doing it out of love. The silence began after I accepted a promotion at work. Nothing dramatic. I came home excited, told him over dinner. He smiled, congratulated me, and then for 3 days said almost nothing. Not nothing. He still said please and thank you. He'd answer direct questions. But the warmth was gone, replaced by this polite, distant efficiency that felt like being handled by a stranger who happened to know your coffee order. When I asked if he was upset, he said no. When I asked if something was wrong, he said he was just tired. When I pressed, he looked at me with this mild, patient expression, the kind you give a child who keeps asking why the sky is blue, and said, "Claire, I'm fine. Why do you always have to make things into something? Always." That was his favorite word in those moments. Always, as in, you always do this. You always overthink. You're always so sensitive. It made me doubt the evidence of my own senses. Which, I understand now, was precisely the point. I want to talk about what the silence actually does to a person, because I've seen people roll their eyes at this. People who think the silent treatment is just pouting, just immaturity, something you get over. What they don't understand is that human beings are wired for connection. We are social creatures at a neurological level. When the person who is supposed to be your closest relationship in the world suddenly withdraws, not in anger, not an obvious punishment, but in this cool, deniable non-presence, it does something to your sense of reality. You start questioning yourself. Was I too loud? Too much? Did I say something wrong? You replay conversations the way detectives replay security footage, looking for the moment it all went wrong. And because Marcus was so consistent in his denials, "I'm not ignoring you, I'm just tired. I don't know why you always read into things." I started to wonder if maybe it really was me. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I did make things into something. Over 18 months, I watched myself shrink. I stopped mentioning work successes. I stopped inviting friends over because Marcus always seemed vaguely inconvenienced by them, and then the silences after their visits would last longer. I stopped wearing red, which had always been my favorite color, because I noticed he never complimented me in it, and once said it made me look a bit desperate. I stopped being the version of myself that had once believed she had a pure heart. I became instead a woman who walked carefully in her own home, who measured her words before speaking, who flinched at silence the way other people flinch at shouting. And here's the cruelest part. I thought I was being a good wife. I thought I was learning how to communicate better, how to need less, how to be less of a burden. I thought the goal was to earn back the warmth. I didn't understand that his goal, was to make me smaller, quieter, more controllable. I didn't understand that yet. About 8 months ago, something happened that I filed away under strange and chose not to examine too closely, because examining things had started to feel dangerous. I had a phone call with my sister, Becca, who lives in Portland. We talked maybe once a week, carefully, because Marcus had made a few comments over the years about how Becca was negative and always stirring things up, and I'd unconsciously started limiting our calls to when he wasn't home. On this particular Thursday, I told Becca about a fight we'd had, or rather the silent aftermath of a disagreement, and she'd said something that worried her. She said she didn't like how often I apologized for things that weren't my fault. She said I sounded like I was walking on eggshells. I defended Marcus. Of course I did. I explained that I was going through a stressful period, that our communication styles were just different, that we were working on it. That evening, Marcus came home and made dinner. He was warmer than he'd been in weeks. He asked about Becca, which he almost never did. He said, "I hope she's doing well. I worry about her influence on you sometimes, but I know she means well." He said it gently with a small smile, like he was being magnanimous. I felt a cold, strange feeling I couldn't name. How had he known I'd spoken to Becca? I hadn't mentioned it. Her name hadn't come up in weeks. I told myself I must have said something. Or maybe he'd seen her name on my phone. Or maybe it was just a coincidence. I did talk to Becca regularly, so it wasn't that strange for him to ask. I told myself a lot of things. I filed it under strange and closed the drawer. Last Tuesday I was cleaning. This sounds mundane, but context matters. Marcus had left for what he called a systems audit at one of his company's satellite offices. An overnight trip, the first time I'd had the house to myself in almost 4 months. The moment his car left the driveway, I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was clenched. I made tea. I put on music, real music, played at a real volume. Not the background murmur I'd trained myself to keep it at. I sang in the kitchen. I cried a little because I realized how long it had been since I'd done either of those things without monitoring myself. And then I cleaned. Deep cleaned, the way you do when you've been existing in a space rather than living in it, when you need to reclaim it room by room. I moved furniture. I got behind things. The basement had become Marcus's domain over the past year. He'd converted it into what he called a home operations center. Rows of monitors, networking equipment, servers he'd explained only in the vaguest terms. I manage a lot of remote infrastructure, he'd said, and I'd accepted that because I didn't understand it and because asking too many questions had started to feel like provocation. I wasn't trying to snoop. I want to be clear about that. I was cleaning. I was vacuuming the edges of the room, working my way around the heavy oak bookshelf that stood along the east wall. The shelf that held his technical manuals, and incongruously a row of framed family photos that he'd insisted on displaying down there where no one ever saw them. The vacuum nozzle caught on something. I pulled it back and noticed a gap between the shelf and the wall, wider than it should have been, as if the shelf had been designed to swing. I pushed it experimentally. It moved. Behind the bookshelf, recessed into the wall at eye level, was a matte black panel. Rectangular, maybe 8 inches wide, 4 inches tall. There was a small display screen, dark, and below it a numeric keypad. The panel was seamlessly integrated, the edges filled with matching paint. You would never see it if you weren't looking. You would never look if you didn't move the shelf. I stood there for a long time. My first thought, I'm ashamed to admit, was that I should push the shelf back and pretend I hadn't seen it. That was how trained I'd become. My first instinct was to protect his privacy, to avoid the confrontation that knowing things would invite. My second thought was, why does a house need a hidden keypad? I didn't touch the keypad, not yet. I stepped back and looked at the basement with new eyes. Marcus had started what he called his smart home initiative about 6 months ago. New locks on all the exterior doors, fingerprint and code-based, connected to an app on his phone. New cameras at the entry points, which he'd explained as security. A new router and network hub, a server rack that he'd said was for redundant backup systems. He'd handled all the installation himself or with contractors who came on days when I was at work. At the time, I'd been mildly curious but mostly indifferent. We lived in a nice neighborhood and the upgrades seemed, if excessive, at least sensible. I hadn't been given access to the lock app. He'd said he'd set it up for me and then never did. When I mentioned it twice, he'd said he'd get to it. And then the subject had quietly died the way things did in our house, not with argument, but with the gentle suffocation of his indifference. Now, standing in front of a hidden panel in my own basement, I began to connect dots I'd refused to see. The cameras weren't just at the entry points. Looking properly now, I could see small dark circles in the corners of the basement ceiling, and I recognized the same shape, the same matte casing, from the device I'd once noticed in the corner of the bedroom, and accepted his explanation of environmental sensor without question. Environmental sensors. I sat down on the basement stairs. My hands were steady, which surprised me. My mind was doing something I can only describe as very fast and very cold. I thought about the night 8 months ago when he'd mentioned Becca. I thought about the times he'd seemed to know things, small things, unremarkable things that I hadn't told him. The brand of wine I'd been looking at online, which appeared in the fridge 2 days later. The conversation I'd had with my colleague Dana about considering a therapist, which Marcus had referenced obliquely a week after, saying I think it's important that people work through their issues internally rather than paying strangers to validate their feelings. I'd thought at the time that the reference was coincidental. A general opinion, not a targeted one. I thought about all the times the house had felt like it was watching me. Because it had been. I went upstairs. I made another cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table and thought through the situation the way I would have approached a complex brief at work, calmly, methodically, without panic. What did I know? I knew there was a hidden panel. I knew the house was more comprehensively wired than Marcus had disclosed. I knew I needed to understand what was behind that panel before I did anything else. I knew that if I triggered some kind of alert, if the panel was connected to a notification system on his phone, he would know I'd found it, and I would lose any advantage I currently had. What did I have? Time. Approximately 30 hours before he returned. And something he didn't know I had, a very good memory and 4 years of observing Marcus Aldridge in intimate detail. I went back to the basement. The keypad had 10 digits and what looked like a 4 or 6-digit entry system based on the display length. I looked at it for a long time before I tried anything. In movies, people guess pins immediately on the second try dramatically. Real life is different. Real life requires you to think about who set the code and why, what they value, what they consider significant. Marcus was not sentimental in obvious ways, but he had a precise, structured mind. He liked patterns, systems, things that meant something according to an internal logic he rarely shared. His phone passcode, which I'd seen him enter 100 times without processing it, was 6 digits. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the sequence of his thumb movements. I tried his birthday. Nothing. I tried our wedding date. Nothing. I tried his mother's birthday, a date he'd referenced once when explaining why he kept a certain week in April clear every year. Nothing. I stopped. I was aware that some security systems locked after a set number of failed attempts, and I didn't know what this one would do. I needed to think differently. Marcus was a systems person. He thought in terms of architecture. He told me once, early in our relationship, that the best passwords were the ones that were personally meaningful but publicly meaningless, not dates, which were discoverable, but references to things only you cared about. I thought about what he cared about. He'd grown up in a house on Birchwood Lane, house number 2714. He referenced it sometimes when talking about his childhood, not with warmth exactly, but with the particular precision of someone who had specific, unresolved feelings about a specific place. He'd once said the address was the only part of his childhood he could remember clearly. I typed 2714. The display blinked. A second prompt appeared, requesting 2 more digits. His birth year was 1983. I added 83. The panel clicked open. Behind the panel was a compact hard drive bay, 2 drives, both active, both connected to the house network. There was a small interface screen and a USB port. My hands were shaking now, not from fear, from something that felt like the confirmation of a thing you've suspected for so long that the proof is almost a relief. I had a laptop upstairs. I went and got it. I came back. I connected to the drive. What I found was organized with the same meticulous care that Marcus brought to everything. Folders, dated, labeled. He had named the main directory House Management, which might have been almost funny if I hadn't been sitting on a basement floor with cold sweat drying on my skin. Inside House Management were subfolders, common areas, kitchen, bedroom, study, exterior vehicles, and one labeled simply Claire. I opened that last folder first. There were hundreds of files, video files, audio files, even a subfolder of documents that appeared to be transcriptions, because he had at some point set the system to transcribe recorded audio. My voice, my conversations, rendered into neat blocks of text with timestamps. I scrolled through dates at random. There was the phone call with Becca 8 months ago, all of it, word for word. There was a conversation I'd had with myself while cooking, talking through a presentation I was preparing, the way you do when you're rehearsing. There were my private phone calls with my mother, with Dana, with friends I hadn't seen in a while because I now understood Marcus had always seemed to know exactly what I'd said to them and exactly how to make me feel guilty for having said it. There was footage. The bedroom. I won't describe what I felt when I understood what that meant, that he had recorded me in the most private space of our home, without my knowledge or consent, for months, and then there were his notes. In a folder marked analysis, Marcus had kept a log, not just of recordings, but of his interpretations. Observations about my behavior, cross-referenced with dates and events. It read like a clinical study. He noted when I seemed elevated, his word, and what I'd been doing in the preceding hours. He noted when my contact with certain people, specifically Becca and Dana, correlated with what he called destabilization events. My term would have been the times I'd asked him if something was wrong or expressed that I was unhappy. He had mapped the inputs and outputs of my emotional state like he was debugging a system. He knew I was unhappy. He had measured and documented my unhappiness, and he had done nothing except tighten the parameters of my isolation. This is the part that people struggle to understand about men like Marcus, the disconnect between how they appear and what they are. In the 3 years before our marriage, he was the most attentive person I'd ever known. Thoughtful, detail-oriented, remembered everything. When I was sick, he made soup from scratch. When I had a difficult week at work, he ran a bath without being asked. He seemed to understand me intuitively, preemptively, in ways that felt almost magical. I know now that what I experienced as connection was surveillance in an earlier form. He was studying me, learning my patterns, not to cherish them but to use them. The cold, distant man who deployed silence as a weapon for the past year and a half. The man whose entire face went carefully neutral when I entered a room. That man had also spent months building an infrastructure to watch me, to document me. Not because he loved me too much and couldn't let go. Not because he was afraid of losing me. Because he wanted control, and love without control made him feel unsafe. There's a word for this. There are several. But in that basement, with a laptop full of evidence on my knees, the word I kept coming back to was trapped. He had made me feel crazy for trusting my own perceptions. He had made me feel small and difficult and too much. He had simultaneously surveilled my every moment and denied me any intimacy. He had taken the 4 walls of our home and made them into a cage, and then convinced me I was the one who couldn't function without bars. I sat with that for a moment, and then I got to work. The first rule I decided was, he cannot know that I know. Marcus was coming back in 30 hours. The system was connected to his phone. I'd found the notification settings in the drive's interface. Any unusual access, any tampering, any open panels left too long would likely ping him. I needed to gather what I needed and leave everything exactly as I'd found it. I disconnected my laptop from the drive. I pushed the bookshelf back. I went upstairs and sat in the living room for 10 minutes, doing nothing, breathing, letting my heart beat slow. Then I made a plan. I had a friend, someone Marcus didn't know about, a woman named Fiona I'd become close with through a remote work community, someone I'd never mentioned at home because some instinct had told me to keep her separate, to protect that one small space of my life from his knowledge. I texted her now. I didn't explain everything. I said, I need your help with something important. Can you come over tomorrow? While I waited for her to reply, I started building my evidence file. I was careful. I could not copy the drive directly. The file sizes were enormous and the transfer would take too long and leave traces. But I could document. I took photographs of the panel, the hard drive bay, the interface. I found the router's admin settings and photographed the network architecture. The number of connected devices, the camera IP addresses, the system logs showing months of continuous recording. I captured the metadata, file creation dates, the earliest recording timestamps, the evidence of when this had begun. I also photographed his notes, every page of the analysis folder. Those were, I felt, the most damning, not the recordings themselves, but the proof that he had organized and reviewed them, that this was not a security system but a control system, that he had watched me and then used what he learned to further isolate me. Fiona replied, of course. What time? I'll bring wine. I almost laughed. I typed, no wine, and I'm going to need a place to stay. Marcus came home the next evening to a clean house, a cooked meal, and a wife who smiled at him over dinner and asked about his trip. This is the thing I will not apologize for. I learned from him. If he could spend years managing his exterior while surveilling me underneath, I could manage one dinner. He told me about the audit. I listened. I asked follow-up questions. I had, by this point, already spoken to Fiona, already copied every piece of documentation I could, already called my sister, and told her everything in a rush of words that had left us both crying and then both very calm and focused. I had looked up digital abuse resources. I had spoken to a solicitor friend of Becca's who practiced family law who had said, with a quiet seriousness that made everything feel real, what you're describing is coercive control. Document everything. Don't tip him off. So I didn't tip him off. I watched him over dinner and thought, I know what's behind the bookshelf. I know what's on the drive. I know when this started and how it was built and that you have been listening to me for months through the walls of the house where I thought I was alone. I thought, I am no longer afraid of you. I am almost grateful to you because you have shown me exactly who you are and now I do not have to wonder anymore. He said over coffee that he'd been thinking we should replace the living room curtains. He wanted something darker, less exposed. I said that sounded nice. He smiled. The notification I'd seen on my phone that morning had been the trigger, the reminder that the digital lock system cycled its codes every 30 days, always at 7:15 a.m. on the 1st of the month. Today was the 1st. The cycle would change everything. New codes, synced only to Marcus's phone and his biometrics, leaving me with no access and no way to leave without his permission. Unless I moved first. I'd spent the past 30 hours understanding the smart lock system the way you understand a puzzle, finding the architecture underneath, identifying what it needed to function and what would cause it to fail. The system had a vulnerability. During the code cycle window, which lasted approximately 90 minutes, the network had to be active to push the new codes to the devices. If the network went down during that window, the cycle would fail, and the locks would default to their last saved code, a factory reset sequence that I'd found in the admin documentation Marcus had stored, somewhat carelessly, in an unlocked folder on the drive. Factory reset code 0000, standard across the device line. So simple, so devastating that he'd left that in an unlocked folder. But then, he'd never expected me to find the panel. I had everything I needed. I had Fiona on standby, her car parked 2 streets over. I had my documentation transferred to an encrypted cloud drive. I had my passport, my credit cards, my grandmother's jewelry, and a bag packed with enough for 2 weeks, hidden behind the winter coats in the back of the bedroom wardrobe. I had 60 minutes. Marcus left for his morning run at 6:45. He always ran for exactly 45 minutes. He was, in all things, precise. I went to the basement. I moved the bookshelf. I opened the panel, and for the first time, rather than just documenting, I interacted with it. The interface had a network settings menu. I navigated to it. My hands were perfectly steady. I have thought about this a lot since the stillness that comes when you have passed through fear and come out the other side into something that feels like clarity. I wasn't calm because I wasn't afraid. I was calm because I had already grieved what I was losing. The marriage I'd thought I had. The man I'd thought he was. The years I'd spent making myself smaller, more manageable, more palatable to someone who was, underneath the charm and the distance and the careful silence, a man who had put cameras in my bedroom. I had already grieved. Now I was just finishing. I disabled the network at 6:52 a.m. The hub went dark, somewhere upstairs. The smart lock status light shifted from green to amber. I pushed the shelf back. I went upstairs. I took my bag from the wardrobe. I picked up my phone, my laptop, my keys. I went to the front door. I entered 0000 on the keypad. The lock clicked open. I walked out of my house into the early morning air and I stood on the front step for one moment, just one, and breathed. It was April. The neighbor's cherry tree was in bloom. A blackbird was singing somewhere I couldn't see. The street was quiet and ordinary and completely beautiful. I texted Fiona, "Coming to you now." I didn't look back. People ask me if I confronted him, if I screamed, if I sent one final, devastating message. The answer is no. Because I understood something by the end that took me a long time to learn. Confrontation is only satisfying when the other person is capable of being affected by it. When someone has spent years managing your perceptions, curating your reality, logging your private moments for their own purposes, the confrontation they deserve isn't a scene. It's the absence of you. It's the unmade bed. It's the front door standing unlocked at 7:15 when the codes cycle and nothing connects. The real confrontation was the evidence package I sent to my solicitor that morning. The photographs of the panel, the network architecture, the camera placements, the analysis logs in his own words. The recordings, time-stamped and catalogued. The documentation of a smart home system designed not to protect but to surveil. In England and Wales, where we lived, coercive control is a criminal offense under the Serious Crime Act. What Marcus had built in our basement met the threshold. The solicitor said so. The police officer who called me 2 days later said so more carefully but said it. Marcus did not see that coming. I know because Becca told me his face when the officers came was not angry. It was confused. He had not expected me to be capable of this level of counteraction. He had, for years, been so certain of my smallness that my competence came as a genuine shock. I found that oddly satisfying, not as revenge, as information, as the confirmation that he had never seen me clearly, only the diminished version of me that he'd spent years manufacturing. I've thought carefully about why I wanted to tell this story. And I want to be honest with you. It's not because I enjoy reliving it. It's because I know that someone watching this is living in a house that feels like it's watching them back. And I want you to understand what that might actually mean in 2025. Digital coercive control is real and it is growing. Smart home technology, the locks, the cameras, the hubs, the voice-activated assistants that are always listening, can all be used as tools of domestic surveillance. You do not have to find a hidden panel behind a bookshelf. You might find unusual devices on your home network. You might find that your partner knows things you haven't told them. You might feel in the home you share with someone like you are never quite alone. Those feelings are worth examining. They are not paranoia. They are not too sensitive. They are not making things into something. In the UK, the Domestic Abuse Act 2021 explicitly recognizes coercive control and includes technology-facilitated abuse. In the U.S., many states have expanded their definitions of domestic abuse to include digital surveillance and tech-enabled control. Organizations like the National Domestic Violence Hotline have resources specifically for technology abuse. You have options. There are people who understand the specific mechanics of what has been done. The silent treatment was the thing I lived with every day. But the silence was covering something much louder, a system designed to ensure I could never quite find solid ground, could never quite trust my own perceptions, could never quite believe I was capable of escape. The thing that saved me was not bravery exactly. It was curiosity. A vacuum cleaner catching on the edge of a bookshelf, 45 minutes of a morning run, and 4 years of quietly paying attention to a man who thought he was the only one taking notes. I'm writing this from Fiona's spare room where I have been for 3 weeks. It smells like old books and her cat Marmite, who has adopted me entirely and sleeps on my feet. I have been sleeping 9 hours a night, which I haven't done in years. I cried for a full day after I arrived. Not grief, release. The way you cry when a thing that's been pressing on you finally lifts. The legal process is slow. These things always are, but my solicitor is thorough. And the evidence is comprehensive. And I have Becca and Fiona and my mother, who cried when I told her and then immediately started researching everything she could find about coercive control so she could be useful. I have also been in therapy. Real therapy with an actual professional, in a room where I can say anything I want and no one is transcribing it. The therapist asked me in our second session what I missed about the marriage. I thought about it for a long time. I said I miss who I was before it. I miss the version of me who wore red and played music at full volume and didn't measure her words before speaking. She said, that version of you is still here. She never left. She just got quiet for a while. I think about that a lot. The blackbird was still singing when I walked down the front path to the street. I heard it for a full block before the city noise covered it. It was the loudest thing I'd heard in months. If any part of this story felt familiar, please reach out for help. You are not imagining it. You are not too much. You are not alone. National Domestic Violence Hotline US 1-800-799-7233 The Hotline. Org National Domestic Abuse Helpline UK 0808-2247 National De Helpline. Org UK. That's Claire's story. And I want to sit with that for just a moment before we close, because this isn't just one woman's experience. This is happening in homes right now. Behind smart locks and quiet dinners and relationships that look perfectly fine from the outside. If this story reached something in you, if you recognized a feeling, a pattern, a silence you've been living inside, please know that you found this video for a reason. Here's what I need you to do right now. Subscribe to her Breaking Point so the next story finds you before you have to go looking for it. Every story on this channel exists because someone was brave enough to tell it. The least we can do is show up and listen. Drop a comment below, even just the word here. You don't have to explain yourself. We'll know what you mean. Share this video with one person, a friend, a sister, anyone in your life who might need to hear that their instincts are valid. Sometimes a story is the only thing that reaches someone that a direct conversation can't. And if you are in a situation like Claire's right now, if the house you live in feels like it's watching you, if the silence is a weapon, if you've started to doubt your own sense of reality, please use the resources below. You deserve support from people who understand exactly what this is. We will be back with another story. Until then, trust what you feel. It's trying to protect you.